At precisely 20 minutes past 8 that Tuesday morning, Miss Agatha Dorrell perceived the lateness of the post as a personal discourtesy and a threat to the moral order of Braden. She stood behind her lace curtain and watched the postman's bicycle retreat with the air of a disappointed institution. 3 minutes, she felt, were enough to loosen the hinges of civilization. The letter itself deepened the insult. It was heavy, official, and utterly indifferent to her existence, being addressed to Mr. Harold Spink of number 17 Wycliffe Terrace rather than to her own respectable door. She turned it over twice, weighing not only its paper, but its implications. It was a letter that belonged elsewhere, and therefore already carried the faint taint of impropriety. Across the street, the curtains of Mr. Spink's house remained rigorously closed. They had been shut since early morning, and in Braden, curtains possessed a character of their own. Open curtains were friendly, trusting, and mildly inquisitive. Closed curtains were proud, defensive, and in the collective imagination of the town, capable of harboring disappointments of every kind. By the time the baker had dusted his second batch of loaves with a conscientious hand, the matter had already begun to ferment. Mrs. Lunn, wielding a tray of currant buns with her usual air of marital martyrdom, had heard that an official envelope had been misdirected. By the time the grocer's apprentice repeated the information to Miss Powell at the drapery, the word "misdirected" had matured into "a deliberately concealed," and this in turn ripened into talk of a thing's being watched. No one at this stage had thought to connect these ideas with the possibility of death. Braden reserved such notions for fiction and London. The postman, on his second circuit, felt a mild professional irritation at the stillness of Wycliffe Terrace. He disliked inefficiency, especially in architecture. He considered ringing the bell and decided against it, then reconsidered and rang it anyway, as a compromise with his conscience. When there was no answer, he experienced the quiet thrill of a man who has acquired news. Mrs. Grimsby, who had been adjusting her front step for no practical reason, was immediately told. Mrs. Grimsby had long believed in the moral value of observing other people's windows, and she received the information with the solemnity of a parish clerk. By late afternoon, a small knot of humanity had formed near the iron gate, each person pretending to be there for some unrelated purpose. Their gazes, however, remained loyal to the closed curtains. It was during this modest vigil that the matter acquired its first suggestion of seriousness. Inspector Pirbright, at that same hour, was engaged in the careful alignment of reports in an office that smelled permanently of polished wood and restrained ambition. He had been in Braden a short time, though already the town had taken on for him the quality of a long-running conversation that had paused rather than ended. When the constable spoke of something "yard," he received the word as one receives a courteous invitation. He walked, rather than hurried, to Wycliffe Terrace. His pace was measured, as though he felt it unwise to alarm the geography. The gate offered only the mildest resistance. The front door, upon being tried, revealed itself as unlocked, as if it had grown tired of formalities. The hallway smelt of polish, of respectable habits, and of something newly out of harmony. There was a silence that did not belong to ordinary afternoons. Mr. Harold Spink sat in a chair as though he had been invited to wait indefinitely, his head inclined at an angle that served no social purpose. There was a cup of tea on a small table, untouched, developing the thin film that tea acquires when left alone too long with its thoughts. Nearby lay a letter, opened badly, as if the hands that had torn it had abandoned their usual sense of ceremony. No one spoke at once. The constable looked at the floorboards, perhaps in the hope that they would provide advice. Pirbright looked instead at the room. He observed that the chairs were slightly too straight, the rug too careful, the clock immobile at 3 minutes past 8, like a small mechanical witness that refused to be drawn further into events. Outside, the light altered, as it does in market towns when gossip is beginning to consider growing legs. Miss Dorrell crossed the road with a discretion that succeeded only in making her more visible. The postman met her glance with the solidarity of a man who has fulfilled his civic obligations. "Well," she said, to no one in particular and to everyone within reach, "I suppose it had to be something sooner or later." Inspector Pirbright noticed the opened letter. He did not read it. He did not touch it. He merely allowed its presence to arrange itself within his mind like a piece set aside in a patient game. A small delay, respectable, and almost innocent, had already altered the day's arrangement. And in Braden, where time was usually as well behaved as a polished sideboard, something had arrived with indecent haste. The house seemed to accept this new status with reluctance. Even the wallpaper appeared faintly troubled, its small floral repeats offering no comment but registering, perhaps, a quiet displeasure. Pirbright felt no need to hurry the moment. He understood, as many did not, that rooms spoke more clearly when given the courtesy of time. He listened with his eyes, taking in the alignment of the ornaments, the slight shift of a photograph frame, and the faint track of breathless movement in the dust upon the sideboard. None of these things declared themselves important, yet none were entirely innocent. In the street, voices lowered, then rose, then pretended not to exist at all. Braden, so calm in its habits, had taken in a breath and had not yet decided how to release it. Somewhere a bell rang twice without clear direction. The light in Wycliffe Terrace altered as it usually did toward evening, with a gentleness that suggested no interest in human complications. It slanted itself across the neat front gardens, touched the lace of Miss Dorrell's curtains, and lingered briefly on the locked respectability of the iron gates before continuing on its indifferent way. Inside the house, events arranged themselves with equal restraint. A doctor had come and gone, leaving behind the soft residue of official sadness and a faint smell of carbolic. The constable remained uncertain where to place his hands. He folded them, unfolded them, and finally allowed them to rest at his sides, like objects that had lost their instruction. Inspector Pirbright moved little, which was not the same thing as doing nothing. He regarded the room again as though it were a person whose manners he was learning. Harold Spink had been a curate in his younger years, and the house now carried the faint air of sermons abandoned halfway through preparation. Books were aligned with a neatness that went beyond tidiness into the territory of mild obsession. Each spine faced forward, as if awaiting inspection. The ornaments were dusted, the photographs squared, the small clock on the shelf stopped in its delicate insistence upon 3 minutes past 8. Pirbright leaned slightly closer to the opened letter, still without touching it. He did not read its contents, but he examined the way it had been opened. The tier was uneven. It had not been made by a man who enjoyed envelopes. It had been made by a man who had ceased, for a short while, to care about paper. A soft sound came from the hallway. Mrs. Grimsby had progressed indoors with the smooth inevitability of someone answering an inner summons. She did not so much intrude as settle. Her presence suggested that a chair ought to be offered. "What a terrible quiet," she observed softly. "You could almost hear yourself breathing." Pirbright inclined his head, which might have meant anything. The quiet that evening did not belong to the house alone. It spread itself across Braden with an untidy determination. At the butcher's, the cleaver fell with less conviction than usual. At the railway buffet, conversation acquired a cautious tone, as if words might be weighed later. The flower show committee held a short, unsatisfactory discussion about hydrangeas and postponed any mention of anything unpleasant, which ensured, naturally, that they thought of nothing else. Miss Dorrell, having returned to her parlour, placed the misdelivered letter upon the small table by the wireless. She did not open it. She did not move it again. It lay there in a small cream-coloured defiance, as though unsure whether it had done its duty or failed in it. She glanced at it once every 6 minutes. In the police office, the telephone rang, and rang with that particular politeness reserved for provincial inquiries. Each voice that came through brought with it a slightly altered version of the truth. Someone had heard voices at the house. Someone had seen movement. Someone had reported that Harold Spink had been odd for weeks, which in Braden could mean anything from mild discourtesy to an unwise preference for tinned peaches. Pirbright listened to these reports with the calm attention he gave to all weather forecasts. He did not reject them. He did not embrace them. He allowed them to become part of the town's texture. Later, when he returned briefly to Wycliffe Terrace, he noticed that the light from the street lamp had found its way into the room. It rested upon the letter and the cup of tea and the small clock, linking them in a narrow strip of quiet illumination. Beyond that strip, the wallpaper waited, its pattern repeating itself like a town scandal that refused to grow dull. The constable cleared his throat. "It don't look like much of a crime, sir," he said, as though apologizing to propriety itself. Pirbright gave him a small courteous look, "Appearances," he replied gently, "have always been rather industrious. Outside, a car drew up without unnecessary noise. So, it was a modest vehicle which seemed appropriate to the hour. From it emerged a woman who walked with the careful assurance of someone who had practiced arriving without disturbing her hat. Her name was not yet known to anyone standing there, but her presence announced itself in that quiet, gravitational way possessed by persons who invent explanations. She paused at the gate. She looked at the curtains. She did not go in immediately. Pirbright, watching from the shadowed hallway, observed her posture, the angle of her gloves, the way she hesitated before stepping forward. He noticed that she carried no handbag large enough for secrets, which made him suspect she carried them very neatly elsewhere. She rang the bell. The sound moved through the house like a suggestion. The constable went to the door, moved by habit rather than hope. When he opened it, the woman smiled with the delicate composure of someone who did not often raise their voice. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I believe I may be rather late." It was not clear to which matter she referred. Pirbright remained where he was, his attention quite politely rearranging its priorities. The town, he was beginning to suspect, was equipped with more doors than was strictly necessary, and not all of them were made of wood. Behind him, the small clock remained stopped. Before him, a new presence stood framed by the quiet light. The silence no longer felt empty. The woman at the door said that she was late, as if lateness were a social error rather than a temporal one. And in Braden, such distinctions were considered important. Her voice was quiet, her vowels arranged with care, and her face carried the composed expression of someone who believed strongly in correct entrances. The constable hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as though the hallway might offer advice. Inspector Pirbright stepped forward, just enough to be seen, but not enough to alarm. "You are quite at the right moment," he said, which was true in a sense that did not promise comfort. Her name, when she gave it, was Mrs. Celia Harland. She explained, gently, that she had known Mr. Spink for some little time, and that she had heard of his small disturbance. The word disturbance gained a faint tremor as it left her lips, as if it were being asked to perform duties beyond its nature. She did not look at the body. Instead, she looked at the furniture, at the closed clock, at the cup of tea with its faint film. Her gaze avoided the chair with a delicacy that suggested practice. In the street, the rumour adjusted itself. What had been a story of silence became a story of visitors. A strange woman had arrived. She was either a chew-com or not calm enough, depending upon the temperament of the speaker. Someone, with a fertile sense of civic drama, suggested she was connected with London. By early evening, London had become involved in everything. Miss Dorrell observed these developments from behind her curtains with a satisfaction that surprised even herself. She lifted the wrongly delivered letter, placed it nearer to the edge of the table, then moved it back. She considered whether to mention it to anyone, and decided sensibly that one could not rush into public virtue. Inside the house, attention began to drift toward emphases that were too neat. The constable felt in his marrow that the open letter on the table was important, simply because it looked disturbed. He pointed at it rather more often than was decent. "It looks like bad news, that," he remarked, as though the letter might contradict him. Pirbright did not disagree. He merely allowed his eyes to pass over other things. A photograph of Harold Spink taken some years earlier, in which his smile appeared to have been borrowed for the occasion. A small, chipped ornament whose position suggested it had been moved and then replaced in a hurry. A rug whose pattern held the faintest suggestion of scuffed impatience. Mrs. Harland stood very still. When she spoke, she emphasized the wrong things. "He was always so tidy," she said, "so very measured, never late for anything. Except perhaps answering letters, he said they unsettled him." This piece of character was offered lightly, as if it were of no importance at all. Pirbright felt it settle somewhere in the back of his thoughts with the faint soundlessness of a well-placed object. At the station, the sergeant considered the case with the help of a sandwich and an opinion. "It could be the heart," he said to no one in particular, which was his way of inviting the world to be simple. The doctor had not entirely committed himself, and in Braden a half-statement was often treated as a full confession. By the next morning, the market carried a different tension. The apples sat in their crates with conscientious brightness. The fish lay with their usual air of municipal exhaustion. and everywhere low voices hovered just below the level of respectability. "A sad business," said one. "I never liked curtains drawn," said another. Mrs. Lunn, whose memory was excellent when assisted by imagination, recalled that Mr. Spink had once paid for his meat with a sixpence that looked questionable. This was received with a reverence usually reserved for documentary evidence. Pirbright walked through the town and collected none of it as fact. He collected instead the manner in which it was given, the slight lean forward, the lowering of voices, the pleasure that flickered beneath the veil of concern. He returned to Wycliffe Terrace just as Mrs. Harland emerged from the front door. She had not removed her gloves. She had not adjusted her hat. She stood a moment as if uncertain whether to be seen. "You must think it very odd of me," she said, with emphasis on very. "I have found," Pirbright replied, "that oddness is a matter of where one places the stress." She smiled briefly. It was the smile of someone who had rehearsed many versions of herself and chosen one for public use. "We should have written," she said. The word written had been gently weighted. "Yes," Pirbright said without saying it. In Miss Dorrell's parlour, the misdelivered letter developed an atmosphere. It seemed slightly heavier. Slightly more aware, she found herself dusting around it rather than over it. When the wireless spoke of shipping forecasts, she felt that Braden was included in the warnings. The official letter, resting unanswered, began to feel like the unacknowledged presence of a guest who did not believe in making scenes. That afternoon, a small but definite emphasis occurred in the wrong place. The constable observed that the clock had stopped and announced this discovery with satisfaction, as if it had stopped for him personally. He suggested this mattered a great deal. "It might," Pirbright said. He did not ask how it had been stopped. He did not ask who had last touched it. He merely noted the time it stubbornly declared, and the time in which Harold Spink had been expected elsewhere, at a modest meeting of the Civic Improvement Circle. Nobody until that moment had mentioned the circle. Mrs. Harland, overhearing, turned not quite pale enough to be noticed by those who did not expect it. She remarked that such meetings were often poorly attended. Her emphasis was very neat. Outside, footsteps touched the gravel. Someone paused, then moved away. A face was glimpsed and lost. Braden had begun, without admitting it, to choose which parts of the story it liked best. Pirbright stood alone in the small front room for a moment. He let his eyes rest upon the cup, the clock, the letter, the chair, and the doorway. He felt no urge to rush these objects. The wrong emphasis, he reflected, was often more revealing than the right one. And in the quiet heart of the town, somewhere between a late letter and an early death, a pattern had been placed slightly awry. The following morning arrived in Braden with the careful neutrality of a well-bred servant. The sky was pale, the air undecided, and the town resumed its habits with the faint stiffness of people who had slept badly but did not intend to admit it. Inspector Pirbright began the day with a courtesy that was mistaken by several people for indecision. He walked rather than summoned. He knocked rather than entered. He asked questions with the mild deference of a man who believed firmly in the rights of other people to talk themselves into discomfort. His first call was upon Mrs. Celia Harland. She received him in a small sitting room that smelled faintly of lavender and newer furniture. The chairs were placed with precision, as though they had been negotiated with in advance. She offered tea with the slight tremor of a person who felt that good manners were a form of armor. "I wouldn't have troubled you," she said, which was the established way of troubling him. "You are very kind to see me," Pirbright replied, which was entirely true. She spoke of Harold Spink in the tone reserved for elderly china, careful, regretful, and faintly relieved. She told him about his private nature, his little worries, and his habit of allowing correspondence to rest unanswered, as if she were disclosing charming foibles rather than possible alarms. He disliked unpleasantness, she said, laying the emphasis softly, as if unpleasantness might overhear. Pirbright thanked her. This alone unsettled her more than interrogation would have done. From her house he walked to the butcher's, not because meat was involved, but because people talked with more honesty over joints of lamb. Mr. Hempsall, whose arms suggested a lifelong dialogue with carcasses, wiped his hands and leaned forward slightly. "Funny thing," he remarked. "A Spink never came for his order yesterday, always had a chop, same day, same time. Did he ever fail to do so?" Pirbright asked. "Not once," said Hempsall. Not once till now. It was the kind of sentence that sounded practical but carried a thin thread of wonder. In the drapery, Miss Pell spoke of gloves. Gloves in Braden were rarely just gloves. He had a torn pair, she said. Wouldn't let anyone mend them. Said they reminded him of something. A what? Pirbright asked. She lowered her voice, which added tremble to the air. Ah? He said it was better not to be reminded. Of more direct interest to the town was the matter of the Civic Improvement Circle. By midday it had been translated by conversation into a secretive body of undefined power. It had minutes, it had notes. It had, in some accounts, a safe. Pirbright attended its modest meeting room, where 4 members sat in a rectangle of discomfort. They insisted upon offering him a chair. He accepted because discourtesy is a form of violence. He wasn't regular, said Mr. Darsk, who kept the minutes and therefore believed strongly in the superiority of ink. Not unreliable, you understand, just thoughtful. Thoughtful in Braden could mean dangerously alive. They spoke of projects, a new path by the river, a hedge rearrangement, a proposed plaque. They spoke too of a debate that had occurred some weeks earlier, involving the placement of a memorial bench. It grew lively, admitted Mrs. Cormack, who looked as if she disapproved of life in general. Did Mr. Spink object? Pirbright asked. Oh no, they said quickly, which was not quite an answer. They explained that he had had reservations which were more difficult to handle. He had believed the bench should face the water, not the footpath. It was a small disagreement, but in a small town such things acquired edges. By afternoon, Pirbright returned to Wycliffe Terrace. The house retained its careful silence. The furniture appeared unchanged. The clock remained stubborn, and the opened letter lay with its quiet accusation on the table. This time he picked it up. He did not read every word. He did not need to. The letter's tone was enough. It was the kind of letter that wore courtesy like a disguise and carried intent in its cuffs. It spoke of deadlines. It spoke of clarification. It suggested delicately that something had been overlooked. There was a mild pressure in the language, like a hand resting just behind the shoulder blades. Outside, Miss Durrell finally surrendered to what she called her civic duty and carried the misdelivered solicitor's letter to its proper house. She did so with an expression of weary sacrifice, as though correcting the postal service were a burden unfairly laid upon her. There was no answer at number 17. She returned home with the letter still in her hand and placed it back in its earlier position. It seemed relieved. Pirbright, standing in the quiet front room, heard footsteps outside. Someone paused. Someone moved on. The town was measuring the distance between curiosity and respect. It was then that the courtesy of the situation presented itself most clearly. Everyone was being polite, too polite. Doors were opened gently. Sentences were softened. Opinions were wrapped in manners. And yet, behind the manners, a different set of energies was at work. Pirbright replaced the letter on the table. He adjusted nothing. He felt no urgency to rewrite the scene. A crime, he reflected, was often a breach not of law but of courtesy, and courtesy, once broken, left traces that could be read by anyone who knew where not to look. In the stillness of the room, with the stopped clock and the untouched tea, the town of Braden folded its hands and waited for permission to believe itself innocent. The afternoon arranged itself around trays, teaspoons, and carefully judged silences. In Braden, tea was never merely a beverage. It was an occasion for the orderly exchange of uncertainties. Mrs. Lund's terroom smelt of sugar, starch, and restrained speculation. The cups were thin, the saucers faintly chipped, and the cakes arranged with the overconfidence of items that believed they were being admired. Conversation moved in gentle circles, avoiding the unpleasant centre that everyone could feel but no one would name directly. Inspector Pirbright took a small table by the window and accepted a cup of tea as though it were a social obligation rather than a refreshment. He sat, he stirred, and he listened. At the next table, 2 members of the needlework circle discussed timings with an air of quiet alarm. He would have been here, one said. He never missed, said the other. Except last Thursday, said the first. That don't count, said the second. He'd had that letter. They both looked down at their laps as if letters had become indecent. A tray of seed cake was passed from hand to hand. The knife paused. Someone remarked that the cake seemed a trifle dry, and the words hovered, gathering meaning beyond their station. Pirbright folded his hands loosely. Timings, he knew, were rarely about clock. At the counter, Mrs. Lunn leaned toward him with the careful intimacy of a woman who trusted crockery more than people. "He was always in at 4, she said. "The same chair, same pot of tea. I'd have it ready before he asked." "Did he ask for it yesterday?" Pirbright inquired. "No," she said. "That was what unsettled me." The word unsettled was offered as if it were a diagnosis. He paid and left with a nod that caused a mild ripple in the room. Outside, the street was busy with its usual polite traffic, bicycles passing each other with exaggerated patience. The clocks in the shop windows disagreed quietly among themselves, and the bells of the church expressed no opinion. At precisely 3:20, Pirbright stood by the gate of Wycliffe Terrace and looked once more at the curtains. They were not drawn now. They hung apart like decorous witnesses who had tired of secrecy. Inside, the room still arranged itself with more care than affection. The tea had been taken away. The chair remained. The letter rested where it had been placed. The clock, repaired by a practical hand, now ticked with faint resentment at being corrected. The constable spoke of timings again. "A doctor says it might have been earlier," he said, "or later. Hard to tell." "Hard to tell what?" Pirbright asked. "When," said the constable, satisfied to have named a difficulty. Later still, he called upon Miss Dorrell, who received him with a shawl placed very deliberately across her shoulders, as though prepared for photographs that would never be taken. She poured tea without being asked, which in Braden was a small admission of excitement. "It's about that letter," she said before he had spoken. "I thought it might be," said Pirbright. She explained that she had attempted to deliver it, that she had displayed appropriate restraint, that she had not, under any circumstances, opened it. Its weight, she felt, had increased. "It was stamped," she added, as if naming a moral failure. "That can be important," Pirbright allowed. "But it came too late," she said, almost to herself. He glanced at the clock on her mantelpiece. It was 3 minutes slow. It was always 3 minutes slow. It was always 3 minutes slow. That evening, the Civic Improvement Circle met unofficially in the back room of the butcher's. Sandwiches were served as a precaution. The talk was cautious, moving from the new river path to the matter of Harold Spink with deliberate clumsiness. "I was to sign some papers," said Mr. Darsk. "What papers?" said Mrs. Cormack. "Nothing important," he said too quickly. Pirbright, sitting near the door, took this in without visible interest. Outside, unseen, Mrs. Harland passed the window and did not look in. By early dusk, Braden had adjusted its internal clock. Publicly, it spoke of unfortunate events and decent respect. Privately, it rearranged its recollections. Harold Spink, once merely a quiet man in a quiet house, began to develop an afterlife more interesting than his actual existence. He was described as nervous. He was described as secretive. He was described as potentially involved in matters that had no clear shape. Pirbright walked home with the slow satisfaction of a man who found patterns in soft furnishings. He considered tea. He considered cakes. He considered the way people emphasized time when they thought it exonerated them. At the edge of the town, the river moved without comment, its surface reflecting a sky that had no interest in civic matters. The new bench, not yet installed, existed only in arguments and in the private resentments of the civic circle. In the quiet of his lodging, Pirbright wrote nothing. He placed 3 times upon a small piece of paper. 4 o'clock, 3:20, 3 minutes past 8. They sat there like polite guests who knew too much. The house at Wycliffe Terrace, now empty and watched, continued to keep its own opinions. Somewhere within its walls, the memory of a cup of tea and an unopened letter lay like crumbs waiting for a pattern to be recognized. And in Braden, tea cooled gently in cups while the timings of small, ordinary lives arranged themselves toward a conclusion that no one yet wished to name. The clocks went on ticking, not in agreement, but in quiet, civil disagreement. The town of Braden entered its afternoon as one might enter a drawing-room already occupied by an uncomfortable truth. Doors were opened with a fraction too much gentleness, cups were lifted with unnecessary care, and every conversation contained the faint creak of a floorboard that had learned it was being listened to. Inspector Pirbright stood at the corner of Larch Street and waited for nothing in particular. This in itself was an interruption. Braden preferred its officials brisk, measurable, and faintly apologetic. A man who waited was a disturbance to the local rhythm. The interruption arrived in the form of Mr. Darsk. who approached with the air of someone prepared to collide courteously. "Inspector," he said with a nod that collided with his hat. "A good afternoon," Pirbright replied, though the afternoon had not yet decided what it intended to be. Mr. Darsk spoke of minutes. He spoke of records. He spoke of the weight of responsibility. It was a conversation that interrupted itself repeatedly, each sentence starting briskly and ending in politeness. He was an awkward sort of fellow, Mr. Darsk said at last, as though confessing to a crime of his own. "Awkward?" Pirbright asked. "In a quiet way," said Mr. Darsk. "Always insisting on arrangements." Arrangements in Braden were the last refuge of the cornered. Across the street, Mrs. Lumb paused in the act of lifting a tray. She chose that moment to address a remark to no one, which was, in fact, intended for everyone. "One can't be too careful these days," she said, and rearranged a sugar bowl that did not require it. The interruption that followed was smaller, and therefore more dangerous. In the front room of Wycliffe Terrace, the clock, newly repaired and newly offended, faltered. Not stopped, not broken, simply faltered, like a gentleman searching for the correct word, the constable noticed. He noticed with satisfaction. "It's doing it again," he said. Pirbright did not answer. He watched the second-hand move, hesitate, then move again. He watched the faint scratch in the varnish beneath the clock, which suggested that it had been lifted before, not by a curious hand, but by a careful one. Later, he called upon Miss Pell. Gloves lay in small, neat stacks like polite accusations. "He came in 2 weeks ago," she said. "He asked about repair. I told him I could fix them nicely. And," Pirbright said, for he said she lowered her voice and that some tears were useful. Useful tears were not a local fashion. At the vicarage a bell rang twice and then stopped. The vicar, who had been informed of everything in fragments, made tea that tasted faintly of indecision. "I can't imagine Harold involved in anything unbecoming," he said, which was Braden's strongest form of imagination. That evening, rain fell with an inadequate excuse of seriousness. It did not soak. It did not cleanse. It merely softened the edges of things. Pirbright stood under the awning of the stationer's shop and waited through the interruption of footsteps he had heard before they happened. Mrs. Harland came into view, walked past him, stopped, and turned with the courtesy of a woman interrupting her own escape. "You are very thorough," she said. "I try not to be discourteous," he replied. She mentioned the civic circle without being asked. She mentioned the bench. She mentioned the argument. "He felt strongly," she said. "So do many people," Pirbright observed. "But not many people die at 8:03, she said, and immediately looked as though she had spoken of the wrong weather. The interruption settled between them. "I was late," she added, which did not explain anything. At the police office a telegram arrived by mistake, intended for a man whose name resembled Spink by only the most accidental sympathy. It was laid aside. It was forgotten. It was, nevertheless, seen by 3 different people who would later swear they had not read it. Miss Dorrell, adjusting her curtains for no practical reason, perceived movement across the street. She interrupted herself by breathing in sharply, as though the air had offended her. Someone entered number 17. Someone left. No one spoke of it directly. At the butcher's back room, the civic circle debated whether an interruption was worse when polite or when abrupt. This was done over sandwiches that tasted faintly of fear. "Perhaps," said Mrs. Cormack, "we should postpone everything." "Haw," said Mr. Darsk, "we could proceed as planned." Planned in Braden was an interruption of fate. Back in Wycliffe Terrace, the clock regained its confidence. The room did not. Pirbright stood by the small table and looked at the stain left by the teacup. It had been wiped badly, not by a careless hand, by a considerate one. A person who cleaned while thinking. He walked to the window and opened it a fraction, allowing the air to interrupt the stillness. The curtains moved reluctantly, as if they too were unused to change. Outside, someone coughed. Someone stepped back. Someone chose not to be seen. Interruption, he reflected, was rarely a thing that arrived uninvited. It was usually arranged, made ready, offered a chair. In his lodging that night, he wrote nothing substantial. He interrupted one line with another. He drew a small mark beside 3 names that he did not yet entirely believe. Mrs. Harland, Mr. Darsk, the civic circle. The rain stopped without apology. The clocks in Braden continued to tick, their disagreements now more earnest. Somewhere between a politeness too carefully maintained and an interruption too skillfully arranged, the The shape of the truth moved, slowly and with impeccable manners, toward the next small breach in courtesy. The morning arrived with a steadiness that suggested discipline rather than comfort. Braden, having spent the night with its thoughts arranged in cautious rows, returned to its duties with the air of a town that feared it might be asked to explain itself. Inspector Pirbright was awake before the clocks had come to a universal agreement. He dressed slowly, not for delay but for accuracy, and stepped into the street while the shopkeepers were still arguing with their shutters. There is a particular quiet to a town before it has fully decided what to think, and it was within this quiet that the second discovery took place. It began, as such things often do, with something that looked harmless. At the edge of the river path, where the Civic Improvement Circle had planned their bench with the seriousness of men altering history, a small wooden stake had been driven into the ground. It was neat. It was tidy. It was, in a way, apologetic. Tied to it with an awkward knot was a folded piece of paper. It had been rained on lightly, as if the sky had considered interfering and then thought better of it. Pirbright did not touch it at once. He examined the knot. It had been tied by someone who was careful but not confident. The stake was not new. It had been used before for something else and repurposed by someone who disliked wasting materials. Only then did he open the paper. The writing was careful. Too careful. Too careful. Each letter sat in its place as if it had been invited there by name. It contained only a few words. He was not meant to read it. Nothing in Braden moved quickly, but something in the air realigned itself. By 9 o'clock, 3 people had seen the paper and sworn they had not. By 10, Mrs. Lunn had heard that a threat had been found. By 11, the flower show committee had decided that the incident was probably unrelated to their affairs, which ensured that they were all convinced it was not. The constable, when told, was deeply relieved that something looked like a clue. He approached it with the professional respect of a man who had grown tired of furniture. "Looks serious," he said. "It is economical," Pirbright replied. He folded the paper and placed it in his pocket, not with triumph but with civility. That afternoon he returned to Wycliffe Terrace. The house had changed in a way that only houses ever do. Nothing was moved. Everything was altered. It was as though the walls had heard something they had not expected. In the small front room, the clock now ticked as if it regretted having ever stopped. The chairs remained aligned. The rug still carried the faint scuff that suggested hesitation. The torn-open letter still rested where it had declared itself part of events. This time, there was something else. A drawer in the sideboard stood open a fraction too wide. It had not been forced. It had not been broken. It had simply been opened and never closed properly, like a thought that had been allowed to wander. Inside lay another letter. This one had not been opened. The envelope was thin, cheap, and faintly yellowed by time. It bore no stamp. It bore no official crest. It looked like a letter that had not expected to be saved. Pirbright lifted it and, without ceremony, read what it contained. The writing was not careful. The lines wandered slightly. The tone was urgent without confidence. It spoke of a mistake. It spoke of a meeting that had occurred at too early. It spoke in a frightened and apologetic way of getting it wrong. There was no signature. There was no date. Outside, footsteps paused at the gate. They did not enter, did not leave. They hovered, as if awaiting permission from the air itself. Miss Dorrell, watching from her window, felt distinctly that she was missing something important and resented it. The second discovery altered the conversations. In the butcher's shop, meat was weighed with a greater sense of responsibility. In the drapery, gloves were folded as if they were evidence. The clocks in the stationer's window began to appear less decorative and more opinionated. The Civic Improvement Circle did not meet that afternoon. This was considered by many to be more suspicious than any meeting could have been. Mrs. Harland, for her part, stood at the river fence and looked down into the slow water, which refused to offer reflections of any use. She held her gloves tightly, as though they had begun to misbehave. "You shouldn't think too much," she said to no one. Nobody argued. By evening, Braden had discovered that there were now 2 stories where previously there had been one. The first had been neat. A man had died quietly. The town had adjusted. The curtains had been judged. The second story was untidy. Someone had not been meant to read something. Someone had known and said nothing. Someone had arranged a stake and a message and had tied it with care. Pirbright walked again to the river path. The stake stood there like a small monument to badly handled intentions. The ground around it showed a faint disturbance, as if someone had stood too long and shifted their weight. He knelt and pressed his fingers lightly into the earth. The impression was shallow. The shoes had been ordinary. Ordinary people, he reflected, were capable of the most deliberate acts. Behind him, a twig broke. He did not turn at once. He allowed the sound to find its place within the evening. When he did turn, there was no one there. There rarely was. Back in Wycliffe Terrace that night, the second letter rested where he had found it. The drawer remained open a fraction too far. The house, which had so prided itself on closure, now tolerated an unclosed thing. In his mind, Pirbright allowed the two discoveries to sit side by side. A message tied to a stake, a frightened letter hidden in a drawer. Neither explained the other. Together, they began to suggest that Harold Spink's last hours had not been as quiet as Braden would have liked. The clocks in the town drifted further apart, as though they too had sensed that time was no longer behaving politely. And in the slow movement of the river, which carried no stake and no message, something reflected briefly that looked very much like the shape of intention. That night, Braden slept with the strained politeness of a household after an argument that no one had admitted had taken place. Curtains were drawn with unusual care. Lamps were turned low, as though light itself had begun to ask questions. Inspector Pirbright sat at a small desk in his lodging, not to write, but to allow his thoughts the courtesy of order. He placed the second letter on the table before him, folded, unfolded, and folded once more. He placed beside it the memory of the message on the stake, and beside that the image of Harold Spink's front room, too neat, too arranged, too careful for a man who had, by all accounts, been surprised by his own end. He did not yet permit himself conclusions. In his experience, conclusions arrived early and stayed too long. Instead, he considered people. He considered Mrs. Harland, and her habit of arriving late in a manner that suggested she had not been late at all. He considered the way she spoke of letters as if they had tempers, and of meetings as if they were ambushes. He considered the way she had not looked at the body. He considered Mr. Darsk, whose devotion to minutes had not extended to memory. He had the earnestness of a man who feared chaos and therefore cultivated it in small, careful portions. Pirbright thought of the way Darsk avoided the question of the bench, and the way he had said a planned as though it were a confession that might bruise him. He considered the town itself, which had already decided that propriety was more important than fact. Braden did not mind being wrong, so long as it was wrong elegantly. The clock in his room ticked loudly, as if trying to persuade him it was innocent. It was 2 minutes fast. He did not correct it. Across the town, Miss Durrell lay awake with the solicitor's letter on the chair beside her bed. She had not meant to bring it upstairs, but had done so in a moment of moral confusion. In the quiet of her room, the envelope seemed larger, heavier, more demanding. She found herself wondering whether a too late and a too soon were not, in essence, the same discourtesy. At Wycliffe Terrace, the house passed the small hours in an unfamiliar position of neglect. The open drawer remained open. The hidden letter remained known. The air had lost its habit of pretending nothing had happened. Mrs. Harland, unable to sleep, walked the length of her sitting room twice and then stood at her window. She thought of stakes in the ground and of knots tied too tightly. She thought of words written too carefully and words written too late. Most of all, she thought of being observed and of not being able to tell when that had begun. Pirbright, in his own room, began to consider the matter of timing not as a sequence of events, but as a kind of personality. Harold Spink had lived by timing. The same chop, the same chair, the same hour for tea. Such men often believed that order could prevent surprise. He placed 3 images side by side in his thoughts. The solicitor's letter, heavy official, delivered late. The hidden, frightened letter, cheap, uncertain, undelivered. The message by the river. Careful words badly tied. Someone had attempted to correct something. Someone had failed. Someone had arrived too early or too late and tried clumsily to restore the shape of things. In Braden, such efforts were usually directed at reputations. The following morning crept in without enthusiasm. Milk bottles were placed with exaggerated delicacy. A dog barked once and then stopped, as though considering whether noise was still allowed. The baker paused longer than necessary before opening his door. Pirbright rose and dressed slowly, allowing the day to take its shape without interference. On his way out, he paused at the parlour window. Across the street, the house opposite his lodging had its curtains half drawn, which in Braden was a position of moral uncertainty. He walked instead toward the river path, not because he sought the paper, which had been removed, but because places sometimes retained opinions long after objects had been taken away. The grass around the stake had been disturbed again, very slightly. A different foot, perhaps, a different weighting. He did not kneel this time, he merely observed. From a short distance away, he felt rather than heard the presence of another person. When he turned, it was Mrs. Harland. She smiled, faintly. "I thought I might see it," she said. "So did I," he replied. They stood together politely, like strangers waiting for a late train. Neither spoke of the note, neither spoke of the letter in the drawer. They spoke instead of the weather, which was behaving unpredictably. "You have a quiet way of looking at things," she observed. "I have found that loud thinking often startles the answers," he said. She looked at the grass. She looked at the water. She did not look at him. "I only wanted things to be decent," she said. It was, he thought, a very dangerous word. Later, he walked back through the town and felt the slight shift in how people regarded him. They had begun to see him not as a visitor, but as a possibility. In the butcher's, the cleaver fell in time to the ticking of the clock. In the drapery, gloves were aligned with greater care. In the tea room, Mrs. Lund served tea that tasted faintly of expectation. Nothing had changed. Everything had been complicated. That evening, in the quiet of his room, Pirbright wrote one sentence. As someone corrected the wrong thing. He did not underline it. He did not cross it out. He simply allowed it to remain, as private considerations are best allowed to remain, quietly, patiently, and just slightly out of reach of the obvious. The clock went on ticking, still too fast. The morning drew its breath with the slow caution of something preparing to be watched. Braden's pavements were swept with more care than usual, and shutters were lifted as if they might be observed for correctness. Even the pigeons moved with a degree of respectful hesitation. Inspector Pirbright chose his morning with deliberation. He did not announce what he intended to do. He did not summon anyone. He merely allowed the town to arrange itself around a small, polite disruption. At 11 precisely, he walked to the reading room, attached to the Civic Improvement Circle, a narrow, agreeable space that smelt faintly of old paper and younger discomfort. The long table had been polished by hands that believed strongly in surfaces. Chairs were placed with a neatness that suggested fear of asymmetry. Mr. Darsk arrived first, which was not an accident. He seated himself with the air of a man who had brought his own unease. "This is most irregular," he said at once, as though fearing that silence might accuse him. "I thought we might speak together," Pirbright replied, which sounded like an apology but was not. Mrs. Cormack arrived next, bringing with her the conscientious stiffness of a woman who trusted rules but not people. She sat without removing her gloves, which was a kind of declaration. Finally, Mrs. Harland arrived. She paused in the doorway, smiled faintly, and chose her chair as if choosing a version of herself. Pirbright waited until the clock on the wall had completed a full minute. He watched the hands. He allowed the quiet to gather like a well-behaved guest. "I am very sorry to trouble you," he said, which in Braden meant that trouble had already arrived. He folded his hands gently. "I have been thinking about the timing of things." Mr. Darsk leaned forward. Mrs. Cormack folded her arms. Mrs. Harland crossed her ankles with great care. "He was not meant to read it," Pirbright said softly. The words were not thrown, they were placed. There was a pause that might have been taken for politeness, had it not been so full. Mr. Darsk blinked. Mrs. Cormack stared at the wall. Mrs. Harland's smile did not move but tightened, as if it had been briefly touched with cold. "It was only a thought," Pirbright added with mildness. "Letters, as we know, have a habit of arriving when people are not prepared." Mr. Darsk cleared his throat. "I'm not certain what you imply," he said. "Oh, I am not certain either," Pirbright replied. "That is why I am asking." The clock ticked with an indecent confidence. "I wondered," Pirbright went on, "whether any of you had ever waited too long to say something which, in retrospect, might have been more useful if said sooner." Mrs. Cormack's fingers tightened in her gloves. Mrs. Harland's eyes lowered, then lifted again, as if she were choosing a safe height at which to hold them. Mr. Darsk gave a small, unpleasant laugh. "We are talking about benches, Inspector," he said, "and hedges, and paths." "Yes," said Pirbright. "Often." He rose slightly. not standing, merely altering his relation to the furniture. "There is an interesting thing about politeness," he said. "It permits us to delay very serious matters under the impression that we are behaving well." No one objected. He turned his gaze briefly to Mrs. Harland. "You said once that you should have written," he remarked. She inclined her head. "We say many things," she replied. "Yes," said Pirbright. He reached into his coat and removed nothing. The gesture alone caused a faint stir in the air. "Well, the river path," he said. A small message was left. It was not loud. It was not threatening. It was in a way very decent. Mr. Darsk's hands moved on the table and then stopped. Mrs. Cormack inhaled sharply and then corrected herself. Mrs. Harland said nothing. "I wondered," Pirbright continued, "if that message was intended to correct something that had already happened." Mr. Darsk found his voice again. "There was no reason for such things," he said too quickly. "And none at all. Harold was prone to ideas." "Whose ideas?" Pirbright asked quietly. Silence, which had been waiting, took its seat more firmly. Outside, Miss Pell passed the window and glanced in, as though hoping for movement. Mrs. Harland folded her gloves carefully. "He was distressed," she said at last. "About the bench." Mr. Darsk moved as if to speak, then did not. "In what way?" Pirbright asked. "He thought someone had misunderstood him," she replied. "He was late, or early, I'm not certain." "Well, that is often the most useful part," Pirbright said. He leaned forward very slightly. "I have noticed," he said, "when men of quiet habits feel they have made an error, they either confess it or attempt to correct it." Mrs. Cormack's lips pressed together very thinly. "And when the correction goes wrong?" he added. Mr. Darsk's chair made a sound it had not intended to make. Mrs. Harland stood. It was not dramatic. It was not sudden. It was merely inevitable. "You are very careful with your questions," she said. "I try to be courteous," he replied. She looked at him without the smile. "You ask them in the wrong places." "Or," said Pirbright, "the right ones." She sat again, slowly. The clock moved on. He gathered nothing. He accused no one. He simply placed his thoughts in the middle of the table, folded and neat. "I am grateful to you," he said. "You have been most helpful." They did not believe him, nor did they contradict him. That afternoon, Braden felt the alteration without understanding it. Mrs. Lunn served tea with unsteady hands. The butcher paused before lifting his cleaver. Miss Dorrell found herself adjusting nothing for many minutes at a time. The carefully placed question had done its work. It had not forced. It had not accused. It had merely unsettled the furniture of certain minds, shifting chairs that had stood too long in the same positions. Pirbright walked back through the town with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had set a clock running and did not intend to watch it too closely. Behind him, the Civic Improvement Circle sat very still, aware that something had been touched that could not now be untouched. Somewhere nearby, the river moved on, indifferent and reliable, and in the steady ticking of the town's various clocks, the answer began, very slowly, to incline itself toward readiness. The afternoon settled upon Braden with the weary tolerance of a town that sensed it was about to be corrected. The air hung quietly, neither warm nor cold, as though the weather itself did not wish to take sides. Cups were lifted and set down without conviction. Footsteps sounded louder than they ought. Something had begun to arrange itself toward an ending. Inspector Pirbright chose the back room of the tea room for what might, in another place, have been called a reckoning. It was not, in Braden, considered wise to conduct serious matters in rooms that lacked proper crockery. He seated himself at the long table that smelt faintly of polished lemon cake and carefully unspoken things. Mrs. Lunn served tea to the assembled company and withdrew with a look of satisfied martyrdom. Mr. Darsk sat very straight. Mrs. Cormack sat very still. Mrs. Harland sat very quietly. Pirbright folded his hands as if preparing to offer thanks. "I have been considering," he said, "how very well we all behave." No one smiled. He turned his attention to the cup before him, as though speaking partly to it. "A Mr. Spink was a man who liked matters to be correct," he continued. "He liked them to face the proper way, to occur at proper times, and to be acknowledged when they had happened." Mr. Darsk nodded faintly without yet knowing why. "He was asked," Pirbright went on, "to attend to a small task, a simple matter. A matter of courtesy, one might say." Mrs. Cormack's hands tightened slightly. He was expected, Pirbright said, to deliver something which to him appeared straightforward. A letter, a communication, a correction of a minor error. Mrs. Harland's eyes lowered. What he did not know, Pirbright added, very gently, was that he was being asked to correct the wrong thing. Silence settled, not awkwardly, but with a certain inevitability. The solicitor's letter, Pirbright said, was never meant for him to see. Mr. Darsk made a sound which tried not to exist. It was meant to arrive after the meeting of the Civic Circle, Pirbright went on. It concerned a small alteration of arrangements, a name removed, another retained, a decision made quietly. Mrs. Cormack stared at the surface of the table as if it were water. But it came early, Pirbright said. Fred said. Or rather, it was brought early. Not by accident, not by malice, but by someone who believed strongly in order. He looked, without accusation, at Mrs. Harland. As she thought, he said that correcting the timing would preserve the dignity of everyone concerned. Mrs. Harland's lips parted slightly. She said nothing. Mr. Spink read the letter, Pirbright continued. He realized that a decision had already been made without him. That the bench by the river, facing the path and not the water, had already been agreed. That his objections, which to him were matters of conscience, had been quietly disregarded. Mr. Darsk shifted in his chair. He did not wish to create unpleasantness, Pirbright said. He attempted to set things right. He wrote a note of protest. He placed it where he believed it would be found. He arranged to attend the house of Mr. Darsk that evening in order to speak in person. Mrs. Cormack inhaled sharply, but Pirbright went on. He was prevented from doing so. The words sat in the room without disturbance. A someone, he said, came to his house, not in anger, not with violence, but with a sense of terrible, careful urgency. Mrs. Harland's gloves tightened in her hands. They wished, Pirbright said, to explain that the letter had come too soon, that things would have been corrected in their own time, that the Circle's reputation would be preserved and that no one need feel disregarded. Mr. Darsk's face had taken on the greyish look of respectable disapproval. The conversation, Pirbright said, was polite. It was courteous. It was also, unfortunately, decisive. He reached for his cup and lifted it, though he did not drink. Mr. Spink, he said, had a weak heart. Not medically weak, perhaps, but socially so. He believed in propriety as some men believe in prayer. When he was told that the matter would never be spoken of again, that his objections would be quietly set aside, that the bench would face the path regardless of his concerns, something within him ceased to insist upon continuing. No one spoke. There was no struggle, Pirbright said, no noise, no violence, only the terrible, quiet surrender of a man who had always believed that timing was the last defense of the powerless. He set the cup down. The message at the river, he said, it was placed there afterward, not as a threat, not as a threat, not as a confession, but as a clumsy, decent attempt to say that it had not been intended. Mrs. Harland's shoulders moved once, as though a breath had attempted to go somewhere else. The letter in the drawer, Pirbright added, was written earlier, when he first realized he had been excluded. It was never meant to be found. He simply did not have the heart to destroy it. The clock on the wall ticked. Mr. Darsk found his voice. We didn't mean, he began. He do not think you did, Pirbright said. Mrs. Cormack folded and unfolded her gloves. Mrs. Harland said, in a voice that was suddenly very small, I only wanted to save everyone. I believe you did, said Pirbright. There was no triumph. There was no satisfaction. There was only the mild relief of things being placed where they should have been all along. Outside, Braden continued its business. Someone purchased a loaf of bread. Someone adjusted a curtain. Someone remarked that the weather had been odd of late. Pirbright rose. I shall trouble you no further, he said. They did not stop him. As he walked back through the town, the clocks appeared, for the first time since his arrival, to agree with one another. The river moved with its habitual reluctance. The bench remained unbuilt. And behind the lace curtains of many small windows, Braden began to suspect that it had not, after all, been as blameless as it had liked to think. The town resumed its afternoon with the mild confusion of people who had heard too much and understood too little. Tea was poured in slightly crooked streams, and saucers rang more sharply than politeness required. Braden, which had long relied upon the safety of silence, found itself experiencing the discomfort of orderly truth. Inspector Pirbright returned to Wycliffe Terrace alone. The house, relieved of company, wore its stillness with greater honesty. The chairs remained aligned, though now they seemed less proud of it. The clock ticked steadily, as though determined to atone for its earlier indiscretion. He stood where Harold Spink had sat and allowed the room to speak. It spoke of habit, of delay, and of that peculiar vulnerability found in those who believe that courtesy can protect them from harm. The cup had been removed, but its pale circle remained like a ghost of restraint upon the table. The opened letter no longer lay there, yet its absence felt noisier than its presence had been. Pirbright considered the economy of violence in Braden. How it did not shout, how it did not raise its hand, how it wore gloves and offered chairs. He walked out and was met by the modest sounds of a town trying not to stare at itself. At the butcher's, the cleaver fell slower, more thoughtfully. At the drapery, gloves were folded as if they had been handled by conscience. At the baker's, loaves were placed with exceptional care, as though a loaf might betray something if set down too quickly. Mrs. Harland remained indoors. She stood by her window and smoothed the fabric of the curtain without moving it. Her face held the look of someone who had removed a picture from a wall and discovered a lighter rectangle beneath, which no amount of adjustment could conceal. Mr. Darsk walked twice around the block without completing an original thought. Every step seemed to acknowledge with sudden politeness that he had been walking on firmer ground than he deserved. Mrs. Cormack unpacked, repacked, and repacked again a set of minutes from the Civic Improvement Circle, correcting nothing and improving nothing, but finding a strange comfort in the repetition. Pirbright took tea alone. The Terroon had resumed its modest theatre of quiet celebrations, though something in the spoon suggested unease. Mrs. Lunn watched him from behind the counter, disapproving and grateful in equal measure. He was a tidy man, she said, setting down a cup that did not belong to him. He was, Pirbright agreed. Later he stood by the river. The stake had been removed. The gross no longer held its disturbance, and yet the air itself retained the faint outline of interruption, as though someone might yet return to stand precisely where the earth had once been pressed. He looked at the water. He did not expect answers from it. He returned to his lodging as the town fell into the familiar compromise between evening and night. Lamps were lit in a manner that suggested care, not comfort. Curtains were drawn but not sealed, as though no one entirely trusted the darkness. He took out the small paper he had written upon days earlier. 4 o'clock, 20 past 3, 3 minutes past 8. He crossed out nothing. He added nothing. Instead, he folded it, placed it inside a book, and returned the book to the shelf as if this were a form of social good. Outside, footfalls passed his window. Someone coughed. A bicycle bell rang twice. Ordinary sounds reclaimed their territory. The house. Miss Dorrell placed the misdelivered letter back in its place on her table, and without noting why, felt less inclined than before to watch it. The clocks in Braden began, almost accidentally, to agree. In the calm after understanding there was no noise, no arrest, no satisfaction in doors closing loudly, only the steady, unremarkable restoration of manners to those who now knew what their manners had cost. Inspector Pirbright sat at his desk and closed his eyes for a moment, not in weariness but in quiet acknowledgement that the shape of things, while never perfect, had at least been made honest. The town, relieved of a burden it would not admit it had carried, folded itself gently back into routine. And in that routine something small lingered, not guilt, not accusation, only the faint awareness that courtesy once misused was harder to replace than silence.